Go through how you can find the sum of an array recursively with Java. So suppose you had this array of 10, 20, and 30, and you want to find its sum, which is the 10 plus 20 plus 30 plus 40. Let's first go over how you do this iteratively so we know what the problem is we're trying to solve. So we need an accumulator variable to keep track of our sum. To find that here on line 9, we'll set that to 0 initially. Then we'll have a loop that goes through every index in our values array. Find that here, and then every time we're going through this loop, we want to add the values at index to sum. And just to double check that this works, let's print out the sum. So once we see this iterative approach giving us that 100, now let's try writing a recursive function that will do the same thing. It'll find the sum of an array. So we need to write a function for that because recursive functions recursive methods call themselves with a simpler problem. So there's going to be a public static function, and since the recursive array sum will return an int, we need this function to return an int, and we'll call this recursive array sum. It's going to need two arguments, the first being the values that we're trying to sum, and then we also need to pass the starting index. So this is going to tell us the first index in this array of values that we want the sum of. So if our array was like 10, 20, 30, and 40, and someone passed a starting index of 0, we'd want the sum of the 10, 20, 30, and 40. But if someone was to pass in the starting index of 3, we'd only want the sum of the array starting at 3. So that would be 0, 1, 2, 3. So it'd be only this 40 because there are no more elements after that 40. Now let's go through the different cases we have to implement in this recursive function. In a recursive function, there are two cases. There's the base case, which is simple, it's like trivial, no work to do. Problem doesn't need to be broken down more. We just know the answer. The other case is, this is the case of the recursive case, in which we don't know how to do the problem right now, but if we broke down the problem a little more, we can solve it. Let's first go through this base case and figure out what we should write here. So our base case is actually when the starting index is ever greater than or equal to values.length. So if the starting index is ever greater than or equal to values.length, we know that the answer of the recursive sum is 0. And the reason that's the case is, let's say in this example, someone had passed in a starting index of 4. So this array's length is 4. So what would be the sum of all the elements after the 4th index? Well, this is the 0th index. This is the 1st index, 2nd, 3rd. Well, there is no 4th index. So if someone is trying to find the sum of all elements after this non-existent 4th index, it's just going to be 0 because there's nothing there. So that's going to handle half of our function. We're already half done. That's our base case. Now we need to write a recursive case that helps us get to this base case. We need to break down the problem each time we call this function. So in our main, someone's going to come to us and say, hey, I want to find the recursive array sum of my values array, and I also have the starting index of 0. So we somehow need to get closer to a starting index of values.length. So every time starting index should be increasing in a recursive case. Well, let's think about how we can write a recursive case that handles that or gets that done. The way we think about the sum of something like 10, 20, 30, and 40 is we can think of that as the sum of 10 plus the sum of 20, 30, and 40. And if we're trying to find the sum of 20, 30, and 40, we can just think of that as 20 plus the sum of 30 and 40. So every time we recurse through the function, we're going to break down the size of the array, or the indexes we have to process, by 1 every single time. So if we look through this example I'm writing over here, we can see how we need to break down the problem. So we'll start out with this large input of n numbers, but every time we go through our recursive case, we're going to break down our problem, making our array smaller, the number of indexes we have to find the sum for smaller, all the way until we hit our trivial case when we have no indexes for which we need to find the sum for, which is our base case, which we know how to handle. Well, let's write that out in code. So if we're not our base case, what should we do? Well, it seems like we're taking the first number of the array and then just finding the sum of the rest of the array. So we're taking the first number, which would be values at starting index, and then we're finding the sum of the rest of the array. Well, how do you do that? And the way you do that is with recursion. So if we call this a recursive array sum function, and we passed in values, but this time a starting index plus 1, we can find the sum of the rest of the elements. So when someone comes to us and says, hey, I want to find the recursive array sum of my values array and 0, it'll look like this. Well, I know the first number is 10, and let me get back to you. Let me find the sum of every other number first, and then I'll tell you what the answer is. Well, the function will make a recursive call to recursive array sum with values and 1, and that will get the first element at values at 1, which is this 20, and then it'll recursively find the sum of 30 and 40 until we hit the base case. It'll recurse on and on until we reach that base case. So in this else case, we take the first number and we take the rest sum, and we're going to return the sum of rest sum and first number. So that's it for recursive function. I'll add a print statement to the top of our recursive array sum function just to see what's happening. Hello from recursive sum, and then I'll also print out the starting index. So if we look up here, we're making a call to our recursive array sum function, and let's see what happens. So it looks like our recursive array sum call with a starting index of 0 is going to make a call to sum of 1, recursive array sum 2, recursive array sum 3, recursive array sum 4, and then once we start returning values, we're able to get that 100 back. So hopefully that helps explain how to recursively find the sum of an array in Java. Thanks.